As you all can see, they've called in the B team for VBS today. I'm Brad Wayland. If I haven't had a chance to meet you, I was a member here about 22 years ago, and my wife April and I and our 5 boys placed membership here a few months back. I'm going to be leading you through a study on Paul's conversion, or maybe we should say Saul's conversion. Let's see if we got it on the screen. We do. Okay. And I might take a little bit different angle than you're expecting this morning. Basically, we'll spend the class trying to frame up Saul and maybe understand. And I don't say that in a way to cast any sort of sympathy on him persecuting Christians, but more from the standpoint of just understanding, how did this man become who he was, and how significant is he sort of in the picture of the Bible? So, basic stuff. I think you'll probably know most of these things. Paul's Jewish name was Saul. He was born to Jewish parents who had Roman citizenship, which gave him Roman citizenship. Sometime after being born, his family moved to Jerusalem. Saul studied under a rabbi named Gamaliel. And so, as we think about Jewish life, I actually stole this from something Jarrett did. Let's see if I can pull it up here. So as we think about Jewish life, learning the Torah, the first 5 books, was a very critical part of their upbringing. This was their school. They spent their first, oh wow, that's really small. They spent their first from age 6 to 10, they spent time in what they called Bet Sefer, house of the book. So in Jewish culture of Jesus' day, they were taught the Torah. They had classes 5 days a week, just like we do today. By the time they were 10 years old, they had memorized all of the Torah. And by that time, most Jewish kids were done with school. It was time to go learn the family business after about age 10. From age 10 to 14, the best of the best moved into what they called Bet Talmud. And here they continued to study not just the Torah, but all of Hebrew scriptures. And they had memorized basically the Old Testament by the time they were 14 years old. After that, there was Bet Midrash, house of study. Very, very few students ever made it this far. The most elite Jews of their time would get to this place, and they would study the scriptures, and then they would have an opportunity to go to a rabbi of different pedigrees, depending on how good they were. And what you wanted to hear from those rabbis after your time with them was, "Come follow me." So I'm going to steal from Jarrett's lesson out at Camp Forge, but when Jesus comes to the fishermen and he meets them for the first time and he says, "Come follow me," this was not the kind of thing that these guys took lightly. These guys had no education. These guys had quit at age 10. They were doing the family trade. And this rabbi comes along and he's impressed them by what he can do with elements of the world. And he says, "Come follow me." And they immediately drop their nets and go. And they immediately drop their nets because 1, they saw something in Jesus, but 2, because a rabbi asked these lowly men, "You come follow me." Let's kind of frame it up a little bit in things that might make sense to us today. April and I in maybe 2013 went to Italy, and we went to Florence. And if you've ever been there, the Medici house sort of owned Florence at the time. So the Medicis were an extremely wealthy financing family. And those wealthy families would take in people. So Michelangelo, that is famous for the David, for other sculptures for the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo came in and lived with the Medicis and studied under them. Now, I don't know if this is how it is in Jewish culture, but that also became sort of a prison for those people. And if you ever go see the Sistine Chapel, what you'll learn very quickly is that Michelangelo was not super happy about having to paint on that ceiling. And he was actually put there as a way of sort of saying, like, let's get him out of his comfort zone by people that didn't want him to succeed. And then he sort of knocked it out of the park and became this really prominent artist. But what I would say is, like, we see this stuff today. You know, in golf, we've seen Tiger Woods was sort of the first of a generation of what does it look like if we take a kid from the time he's like just out of his mother's womb and put him on a golf course and say, you're going to do this 16 hours a day. Let's see what happens. And so he sort of was the start of a new breed of golfers, not guys that just were like, hey, it seems like you can swing pretty good at age 14. Let's get you out there and see if you could be a pro. But people that were, from the day they were born, curated to do these things. Andre Agassi, I read his book, Open. Andre Agassi, from the time he was very young, all he did was eat, drink, sleep, tennis. That's all he did. He became very messed up in the head from it, hated his life, hated all those things. So when we think about these Jews, at that time, it wasn't like it is today. This was how you succeeded in Jewish society. Those that had the intellect, those that had the knowledge of the law, those that rose up, they were the ones that had the highest pedigree. So who was Gamaliel? What do you all remember about Gamaliel? Anyone? Okay, Lawrence says, one of the most esteemed rabbis. Remember any specific stories?
Was it when Peter and John were arrested? He helped settle?
Yeah, so I think it's around Acts 5. Some of the apostles are arrested. And what does he say? He says, hey, you know what? Hold on a second, guys. We've seen some uprisings. We saw these guys come in, and they said they were going to do this thing. And you know what happened? It fizzled out. And then you know what? We saw this other guy come in, and he said, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and we're going to do all these things, and he fizzled out. He says, you know what? If this is from God, you won't be able to stop it. And they did. He sort of diffused a very early situation with those apostles. He diffused it, and they still got beaten. They still were tortured on their way out the door, but they were allowed to escape. And so, but Gamaliel, if you go read about him, Josephus actually writes quite a bit about Gamaliel, and actually his father or grandfather was a rabbi named Hillel, which was the most prominent rabbi of their whole generation. And so Gamaliel was the best of the best of the best of the rabbis. And so when you look at Paul, don't let yourself think like this was just some elite Jew. He was, as he would say, I was a Jew of Jews. I'm a Roman citizen. I'm the best of the best. Nobody is higher than me on the Jewish hierarchy in terms of intellect, pedigree, all the things that you can think of. Okay, so it's not just knowledge, though. Jewish life was centered on prayer. Young Saul would have had tefillin and phylacteries strapped to his arms and his head. Moses had commanded that for the morning service. These little boxes contain scriptures inside them. 3 times a day, every single day, he would cite the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. He'd be looking forward to various Jewish festivals, such as tabernacles, the Passover, commemorating great moments in Israel's history. So what held them back? When we get to this picture of Saul, who's going to be Paul in the New Testament, where are the Jews in their history? What is holding them back? Slavery to Rome, that's definitely what they thought was holding them back, right? They felt like if we could just get rid of these Romans, everything will be fine, right? But well, let's even go back before that. What would have held them back when you look at the Old Testament? What was the pattern of behavior? Say again? Leaving God? Yeah. They were on and off. They would start to do things right, and then what would they do? They would get led away. I mean, let's just think about the Old Testament for a second. What is the picture that we get in the Old Testament? When you study the book of Judges, have you ever seen someone put this little like spiral on like a piece of paper that goes like this? Why is that? That's right. It's a vicious cycle. Yeah, Joshua said, choose this day who you're going to serve. Who are you going to serve? So when you look, kind of going back to what I was saying about the Jewish life that Paul had, they had a rhythm to their life that looked very religious. Okay, so not only, let's take Paul out of it. Paul had sort of this really elite status, but these people were weird. When you think about the Jews, these people were weird. They were not normal. If you think to yourself like, oh, they just looked like the other nations. No, they actually didn't. Even in their sin, they did not look like the other nations. What are some ways that they would have, in practice, not looked like the other nations? They had one God, okay? And we won't have time to get into it today, but let me tell you something. One thing, there's nothing more offensive to other nations. When Paul goes to Athens, when Paul goes to Lystra, when he says in Lystra, he heals a man. I think it's in Lystra, I might get this wrong, but in Lystra, he heals a man. And they're like, oh my goodness, Paul and Barnabas, these guys are gods. Let's lift them up. These guys are gods. Let's take them in. And they're like, whoa, wait a second. No. We're not gods, actually. There's actually only one God. And actually, all the gods that you're worshiping, they're not gods. What did those people do? They stoned them. They went from, hey, this is our new God, to let's take them outside the city and try to kill them right now. There was nothing more offensive to the nations than the idea that these Israelite people thought there was one God. They were okay with many, many gods. What else? What else would look in their behavior, in their patterns of life, what else would look different from the other nations? They have one God. They're not that tricky. These aren't trick questions. They're pretty easy stuff. Yeah. Yeah, they're supposed to be obeying the law of God. Okay, so I'll give you guys a hint. So what about the Sabbath? Right? They didn't work on the Sabbath. From Friday night at 6 p.m. to Saturday night at 6 p.m., they did no work. And culturally, that's an interesting thing because even today, in my line of work, I do phone calls with people all over the world, and sometimes I'll be talking to somebody, and they'll be like, yeah, I can't do that call because it's going to be Sabbath here in about 30 minutes, so I'm going to have to hang it up. And I'm like, I've listened to this person spew cuss words and everything else on the call, and I'm thinking, well, what's going on here? There's a cultural thing there. Even today. The Sabbath. What about this? They really didn't eat meat. Right? They definitely didn't eat pork. They didn't eat any unclean meat, but they were very particular about how much meat they ate. It was not really part of their practice. Their clothing was different. They weren't polygamists. They looked different. This nation did not look the same as the other nations. Okay, so let's go back to this question. Let's talk about the glory days. If you're an Israelite and you're living at the time of Paul, tell me some things that you would consider to be the glory days. Solomon? Yeah, David and Solomon's reign, definitely. The return, yeah, coming back to the temple.
The Maccabean period, their period of independence for a few years there, when they were an independent nation for the first time since Solomon, really.
Yeah, I'm actually going to touch on the Maccabees, but during kind of our period of silence, we've got the Hasmonean revolt. We've got the Maccabees sort of restoring the temple to order, restoring the festivals. I would say some others would be like, we said David and Solomon's reign. David and Goliath. David and Goliath is a high point in their history, and especially because of the motives behind how they did it. David, was it just that David was a boy or a young man that killed a giant, and, that sort of represented we just beat the Philistines? Or was it more than that? What it actually was David was like, hey, you can't say that about my God. You can't talk about him like that. And so David goes, of course, David's out in the field. His father doesn't even remember that he exists in terms of like who's going to be the warrior to fight this Goliath, to fight the giant. He doesn't even remember that he exists. And he's like, well, man, I got this boy on the field. If you want him. Of course, it comes in and says, hey, I've killed a bear and a lion with a bare hand. So, it's, I guess he was pretty tough. But he comes in. I think they think of that as a high point. I think in John, we get some indication of what they kind of hung their hat on a little bit. When you see in John 8, they're saying that they want to kill Jesus, and they keep coming back to Abraham. We serve Abraham. And everything he says about Abraham gets them more and more angry until he says that Abraham saw me. And they're like, you're not even 50 years old, and you're going to come in here and tell us that Abraham saw you? And he says, oh, no, not only that. Before Abraham was, I am. I was there before Abraham. And they pick up stones to kill him. The next chapter, heal a blind man. When that blind man says, I don't know who he is. Maybe you guys would like to go follow him. What do they say? No, we follow Moses. We don't know who this man is that you follow. We follow Moses. So they point back to Abraham and Moses a lot as sort of being the glory days. But the main point I want to tell you about where they are when Saul comes on the scene is that it's sort of the garden story on repeat. There's parameters set. They break those parameters. They disobey, and then they're punished. And they're punished in many ways. They're taken over by the Assyrians. They're taken over by the Babylonians. Before that, they're taken over by the Egyptians. And so they go into this pattern of behavior. Saul's frame. Remember, Saul didn't have the New Testament in his hands. He wrote a lot of it. Saul's frame was, you disobey, you pay the price. That's his frame. Okay, we're going to turn over to Numbers 25. So I want to go into this a little bit deeper, this frame of how Paul may have sort of processed the man that he was. When we find Saul, we find him dragging Christians out, participating in murdering of Christians, seeking papers so that he can go into more synagogues and do more damage. I think in one passage it says he wreaked havoc on the church. Let's go back to Numbers 25. Not a super familiar story here, and I probably will mispronounce a lot of the things in it, but let's read these 18 verses. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. And Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of his men who has yoked himself to Baal of Peor. And behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel, while they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the high priest, saw it, he rose and left the congregation and took a spear in his hand and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. Thus the plague on the people of Israel was stopped. Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. And the Lord said to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and to his descendants after him the covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. The name of the slain man of Israel who was killed with the Midianite woman was Zimri, the son of Zelu. We can skip that. Down in 16, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, harass the Midianites and strike them down, for they have harassed you with their wiles, with which they beguiled you in the matter of Peor and in the matter of Cosbi, the daughter of the chief of Midian, their sister, who was killed on the day of the plague on account of Peor. Okay, so what has happened here? The Moabite women are coming in. The Israelites are intermarrying with them. They're having sexual relations with them. They're being corrupted by these people. God says, I'm going to put a plague out, and we're going to take care of this once and for all. And in the middle of that situation, Moses is standing there, and a man comes across him with a Moabite woman, looks at him basically, walks straight into a tent to go about his business. And Phinehas sees it, and he walks straight into that tent, and he kills them both. And the plague is removed, is given an unbelievable gift. God says, I will give you a perpetual priesthood. God says that Phinehas went into that tent and he restored Israel, and he will be honored for ages to come. Okay, now, I just said when we started class that Paul had memorized the whole Old Testament. Did Paul understand the zeal of Phinehas? Here's what Paul sees. Got to take Jesus out of the picture. He hasn't met Jesus yet. He's met the Old Testament. What Paul has seen is, I remember this one time. People were doing what they weren't supposed to be doing. And a man went into a tent and he killed two people in the very act. And you know what God did for those people? He raised that man up and said, you're going to get a perpetual priesthood. I'm not giving sympathy to Saul, but I will tell you, even Saul himself gives himself a little bit of credibility because he says, hey, I was wrong, but I did it in a good conscience. I was trying to serve God the whole time. I was just doing it the wrong way. I thought I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. So that was his frame of zeal. Let's do another one. Much more familiar story. 1 Kings 18. I'll spare the intro stuff because I think it's so familiar, but basically we have this situation with prophets and of Baal and Asherah, and we got Elijah up on Mount Carmel. Verse 17, when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, is it you, you troubler of Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord. But Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it into pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bowl and lay it on the wood and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people answered, it is well spoken. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose for yourselves one bowl and prepare it first, for you are many. And call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it. And they took the bowl that was given to them, and they prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or maybe he's relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, come near to me. And all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the numbers of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, Israel shall be your name. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench about the altar, as great as would contain 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order, and cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. And he said, fill 4 jars with water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. And he said, do it a second time. And they did it a second time. And he said, do it a third time. And they did it a third time. And the water ran down the altar and filled the trench also with water. And at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord. Answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And Elijah said to them, seize the prophets of Baal. Let not one of them escape. And they seized them. And Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. Okay, super familiar story. Strange ending. Who were the prophets of Baal? Scott says Jews. It's actually kind of mind-boggling how bad this had gotten. We've got 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, or prophetesses, I can't remember. We've got 900 people here that have given up their heritage to go to the Baals. They put this contest on. Elijah dominates the contest, right? Elijah's God wins. The other God doesn't show up. And it's not like when it's done, it's like, hey, see, I told you. Our God is the real God. So turn back to God and let's do things the right way. Isn't that what you would expect to happen there? These are men of Israel. Wouldn't you expect them to say, we won, okay? Now, let's turn this, we're going to do a special class this week and kind of get you back on track. We're going to get everybody together and we're going to get back into the rituals that we're supposed to be doing, and we're going to start honoring the true God. But what did they do instead? They slaughtered them. Remember, Paul didn't have the New Testament. Paul had this. I'm super familiar with this story. Paul had it memorized. He knew. He knew about the time when people were trying to go the right way and thinking they were doing what they thought was right, or what, maybe they didn't. Maybe they thought they were doing what was wrong. But whatever they were doing, he remembered that time, and he knew they were not shown mercy. It was not an intellectual discussion. We didn't just sit around and talk about, hey, like this bail thing. Let me show you something. I mean, have you read this scripture over here? It wasn't like that. When you think about the zeal of Paul, you've got to frame him up with these prophets on Mount Carmel. You got to frame him up with Phineas and the Moabite woman walking in the tent right in front of Moses. You got to understand that the zeal that Paul had, that Saul had, came from thinking, this is how it's done. This is how God handles people that do it wrong. We already mentioned the Maccabees, very similar story. But, around, I think it's around 167 BC. The temple gets defiled. They bring in people to do sacrifices that aren't supposed to be done there. And as soon as it happens, Matthias Maccabee, when they go to do the first sacrifice at the temple, he murders the guy at the altar. And then another guy comes and they murder another one. And pretty soon, Judah the Maccabee, they call Judah the Hammer, comes in and they cleanse the whole temple and they try to restore Israelites' practices. And that actually maintained until Jesus' day, until Herod's temple kind of took over. And I'll just, I don't want to go too deep into this, but I want to tell you that this has not gone away even today. Actually, let's talk about the Zealots for a second. What were the Zealots? Remember Simon the Zealot, one of Jesus' disciples? What was their story? They were trained assassins, so they kept knives on them. You ever seen like a prison movie where a guy has like a shank and they walk up to people and they like stab them a bunch of times and then walk off? That's what the Zealots were like. Their theory was, God hasn't saved us from Rome, so we need to take matters into our own hands. So we're going to go take down Rome ourselves, and we'll do it. We'll start by just, if I see a Roman guy and there's not enough people around, I'll just go after him, kill him, walk away. One of those guys became a disciple of Jesus. One of these assassins became a disciple of Jesus. In 1995, when the then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a student called Yigal Amir. So this is in Israel, Prime Minister of Israel. Rabin had taken part in the Oslo Accords, working out agreements towards peace with Palestinian leadership. In 1994, he shared the Nobel Peace Prize with his political rival, Shimon Peres, and with the Palestinian leader, Yasser Arafat. He also signed a peace treaty with Jordan. All this was too much for hardline Israelis, who saw his actions as hopelessly compromising national identity and security. The news media described the assassin as a, quote, law student. When you read the articles in the media and you hear law student, what do you think? I'm thinking like, man, what's wrong? Like an injury lawyer's up there and he's getting upset about. No, he was a student of the Torah. He was a Saul type. He was one of these guys. He'd studied the law. But in Europe, that phrase carries a different meaning. Carries a meaning different from the one it has in Israel today, and the one it would have had in the days of Saul of Tarsus. Amir was not studying to be an attorney in a Western-style court. He was a zealous Torah student. His action on November 4th, 1995 was, so he claimed at his trial, in accordance with Jewish law. He is still serving his life sentence and has never expressed regret for his actions. The late 20th century is obviously very different from the early 1st century, but zeal has remained a constant. That was 1995. We still have today Israelites that still think of their duty to protecting God's law to be whatever it takes, even if it means murdering people and spending my life in prison. Okay. How much time do I have? I've got 19 minutes. Let's turn to Acts 7. I'm kind of fast forwarding here, but we get to Stephen, a follower of Jesus, and he tells the people that are in charge, the Jews that were not Jesus supporters, he says in verse 51, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit as your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it." Now when they heard these things, they were enraged, and they ground their teeth at him. But he, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, "Behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." But they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and rushed together at him. Then they cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. And as they were stoning Stephen, he called out, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he had said this, he fell asleep. And Saul approved of his execution. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. So we've already sort of framed it up, but here's Saul. And here's Saul doing what Saul thinks is what God wants him to do, which is, I got to keep things the way that they are. He wasn't looking for Jesus. He was looking for something different. He was looking for it to be a little bit different. And Saul's not unique in that way, right? Who else was looking for something different? The other apostles. What happens when Jesus is ascending into heaven after he's risen from the dead? He's been with them. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, and I meant to actually hit that. Let's see here. I think I just skipped over that. Yeah, perfect example is they go up on a mountain. Jesus is transfigured before them, and what do they say? Hey, let's put an altar for Elijah. Let's put an altar for Moses, and I don't know if you must be a great prophet, Let's set up one for you as well. And God's just like, stops the music and is like, no, we're not doing that. This is my son. He's on a different level. They were looking for an earthly kingdom. That's what I was thinking of when all the apostles, when all of them, and he's leaving, they're like, Lord, are you, hold on, just say, are you going to establish your kingdom now? Is that happening right now? What does Paul say in 1 Corinthians, first chapter, about the cross? The foolishness of the cross. Who wants to get behind the kingdom where you go and die? That's the way that you become a king of glory, is to die. Did that look good to the nations? And what did Jesus tell us that we have to do? Hey, if you want to be part of my kingdom, you got to go die too. Now, we die to ourselves. Most of us in this room, probably all of us, won't have to die for the cross. But that's just circumstantial. There's plenty of times in history where people have died for the cross. Literally. But we are all commanded to die to ourselves every day. The kingdom didn't look the way that they wanted it to look. They wanted to kick the Romans out. Let's look at Acts 9 as I sort of head towards wrapping up here. I can't remember if I put this in here or not. I did, okay. Acts 9, 1 through 9. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, Who are you, Lord? He said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were open, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. What did Paul not know about his life whenever he heard Jesus speak to him out of the air as he was traveling on the road to Damascus? We didn't know he's wrong. Who is it, Lord? Let me tell you something else he didn't know. His physical life was over the second that Jesus spoke to him. That's right. He was about to go from being the persecutor to the persecuted. It's hard to articulate how much his life changed on the road to Damascus. I just told you at the beginning of class, this man was as elite as it gets in Jewish culture. He lived a privileged life. He was a Roman citizen. This guy, even when he is down and out and they're ready to kill him, he still has power because of that Roman citizenship. And he's like, no, I appeal Caesar. As soon as he said that, it's like, okay, hold up a second. We don't want to mess with Caesar. Let's get this guy to Caesar. Paul's life was over as soon as he encountered Jesus. And it was over physically in ways that would just be kind of hard to process through. Think about the things that happened to him. The guy was stoned, beaten, whipped. He ran scared at all times from who's trying to get me. He was shipwrecked multiple times. He was imprisoned multiple times. He was left for dead multiple times. And then he has the gall to write things like, hey, but I love suffering because when I suffer, I get to be like Jesus. And the perspective of this guy. He came from a lineage and pedigree that was pretty much unmatched. And became, as my friend David Baxter would call, he became a man without a country. As soon as he was converted, he became a man without a country. And if you really start looking at Acts, what you start to realize is that Paul was hated by all. He was hated by Jews, and he was hated by Greeks. He had no safe place to go. He offended all of them. And he was happy to do it. He wasn't afraid to offend them. But think a little bit about Paul sort of in the, if you were God and you were thinking like, hey, I'm bringing my son to this earth. Jesus had a lineage that he came from, right? And it's not necessarily the most prominent lineage. It has a lot of things about it that are very lowly, kind of helps us understand when he says you're going to die to self, when you're like, here's a guy that came from prostitutes, that came from crazy events that happen in the Old Testament. But when you see Saul, it's almost as if God looked out on his creation, saw all the people of the day, and said, who's the most unlikely candidate? Who's the most unlikely candidate to flip and turn to the good side? I'm going to take him. He's out there killing Christians. Tomorrow I'm going to have him baptizing people. He's out there killing people. People are scared to death of him. He's ravaging the church. I'm going to have him build the church. I'm going to take this man that did so much evil against my people, and I'm going to turn him to be for my good. In Paul, we see a story that all of us can grab onto. It's really important. If Saul can be converted, what can you do that cannot be forgiven and you cannot turn yourself back to God? What is something you can do that will not allow you to receive God's grace and his mercy? If a man that murdered and drugged people out and killed them that were trying to serve their God is able to turn his life around and become the chosen vessel that God had. I had this Western Civ teacher at WKU, and that was the first time I had ever been in a class. I went to Florida College for a couple of years, so when you're there, you're in Bible classes. I mean, your professors are, it's a very trusting environment. You get to learn about things like, people aren't in there being like, yeah, does God even exist? I mean, it's not that kind of thing. You're there with people that have a like mind. And I go to this Western Civ class my junior year of college, and the guy starts talking about Paul. And he says, he's like, this guy Paul comes out of nowhere claiming that he's part of the thing. And he says, oh, and now Gentiles are in too. And he was so just glass half empty, skeptical. But what that guy doesn't realize is that that's how it might look on the surface. What he doesn't realize is that Paul literally was like the most unlikely candidate to ever say those words, to ever say that I've turned to Jesus. And then, of course, it's hard to, you can't articulate this to the Western Civ teacher, but, the Gentiles being grafted in is not an idea that came up in the New Testament. It's all through the Old Testament. It's there from the beginning. It's always been there. Okay, kind of my last thing here is in verse 24 of chapter 9. I'll start in 23. When many days had passed, the Jews plotted to kill him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were watching the gates day and night in order to kill him, but his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. This is just this articulation of the turning point for him. He goes from a man that can walk into any city and be respected everywhere for his education, for his pedigree, for his sort of accolades. And now he learns, hey, people are trying to kill you. We're going to have to lower you out of a window in a basket to get you out of this city at night. That's going to be your new life. Now, Acts is a little confusing because it kind of looks like the next day he walks in, somebody's like, hey, I'm not here to kill you. I'm actually here to save you. It looks like that's what he's saying, but in Galatians we get a picture that he actually spent many years after that conversion. I'm not sure what he was doing. He was studying. He was understanding how the scriptures all tied together. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but He says in Galatians 1, he says, after the blinding light, I did not go to Jerusalem, but I went to Arabia and returned to Damascus. And then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem for 15 days. And then he says that he didn't go back up to Jerusalem for another 14 years. So when we read Acts, it looks like everything's just happening, boom, 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 but it's not. Luke's goal in writing Acts was not to give us a play-by-play of everything Paul did. He was trying to get the message out about what was going on there. So he spent some time after this conversion, and I would just assume that during that time he sort of refined his views, because as we read all the letters that he wrote, this does not seem like a man who came to this realization yesterday. He seems like a man who spent many years understanding how all these things kind of fit together. Anybody have any comments? We've got a couple minutes. Angela? Yeah, Angela said, one thing we learned from this is the difference that Jesus can make in your life, from who we used to be to who we should be. John?
Verse 27, it talks about when he did present to Jerusalem, the disciples were, afraid to be with him. And just a comment that, who was it that said, okay, I'll trust him. I'll kind of introduce him. It was who? Barnabas,
Yeah.
who was known as the encourager.
Yeah.
So it's just a little light for us to go, let's be open to those who, it was because of the actions of Barnabas that we had Paul run into Jerusalem and accept.
Yeah. It's good. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah, it's not a foregone conclusion. And the way our society's gone, we don't really know where things are headed. We sort of live in an upside-down world right now is how it feels. The values that were present when I was young seem to have dissipated in a lot of areas, especially in America. Worldwide, not so much, but definitely in America, we've definitely seen a turning away from in a lot of areas. Persecution is something that could be in the cards. Okay, thanks everyone. Appreciate your participation. And tomorrow I think Frank will be leading the class.